Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christy Koenig, and I'm the EMS Medical Director for the County of San Diego. Welcome to the next in our series of evidence-based medicine lectures for BSPC. Today, we are really pleased to partner with our military colleagues, and I'm going to turn this over to Captain Dr. Walrath to introduce the topic and the speaker for today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Ben Walrath. I am a staff emergency medicine and EMS physician at Naval Medical Center, San Diego. And it's my pleasure to introduce you one of our residents, Dr. Saki Kitadai. She comes to us from Tufts University School of Medicine and is doing a fantastic job in her residency with us at Balboa. She's probably worked with several of you out in the community. If she has not yet, she will in the future, and you'll be lucky to work with her. And she'll be equally lucky to be working with you. But she's prepared a presentation today to discuss pre-hospital fluid resuscitation and comparing alternatives to normal saline, as well as introducing the community to some of the advances in military pre-hospital whole blood transfusion. So Dr. Kitadai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. I hope everyone can hear me. I apologize in advance. I'm in the department today, so if you hear any overhead announcements, that's why. But my name is Saki Kitadai. Like Dr. Walrath said, I'm currently an emergency medicine resident at Naval Medical Center San Diego and a naval medical officer. My presentation today is a review of pre-hospital IV fluids with potential short and long-term strategies to mitigate the normal saline shortage, as well as a plug for the Valkyrie whole blood transfusion course, which is located in Camp Pendleton, California. Thank you to Dr. Walrath and Dr. Les for their mentorship and guidance in making this presentation. And I'm very much a novice to EMS and pre-hospital care, so grateful for this opportunity and hope to follow this up with a more interactive discussion. This is our standard disclaimer. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so starting off with a brief history, the widespread use of normal saline began during the cholera outbreak of the 1830s. Dr. Robert Lewin surmised that replacing the amount of fluid lost back in through the vessels could help patients return to their ordinary, and this seemed to be effective. In 1883, the term normal saline was mistakenly coined for 0.9% saline solution by a Dutch scientist named Hamburg, who mistakenly calculated this as the normal concentration of sodium in the serum, and this stuck. In 1885, Dr. Sidney Ringer utilized a more physiologic salt solution to rehydrate children with gastroenteritis, which came to be called lactated Ringers. And then in 1941, the development of human albumin through a technique called blood fractionation was first developed and used in large quantities to treat burn victims during the Pearl Harbor attacks. So as you can see, a lot of the headway in fluid resuscitation was made early on in its existence, but only fairly recently did we begin formally questioning fluid resuscitation as kind of a normalized standard practice. On the other hand, blood transfusions are very much a history of the battlefield. The first recorded use of blood transfusions in battlefield medicine was in World War I, when Canadian doctors quickly realized that infusing normal saline did little to stabilize shock and save lives in horrific hemorrhagic injuries. A Canadian physician by the name of Robertson was the first to perform a whole blood transfusion in the field, and he wrote several papers documenting its success, which made it the treatment of choice for battlefield injuries. By the Vietnam War, blood transfusions had largely fallen out of favor, most likely due to the relative ease of carrying saline for soldiers, heat conditions which affected the viability of blood, and other concerns for transfusion reactions and infections, which had become more closely studied by this point. And I'll come back to the history of this later. Next slide, please. So what is the current NS shortage that we're dealing with? It's important to acknowledge how ubiquitous and widely consumed this solution has become in the United States when considering the impacts of the shortage. So almost 200 million liters are used in the US each year, and the American Society of Health System Pharmacists cite shortages in all forms. So normal saline flush syringes, small volume irrigation, and large volume bags. There is not currently clear guidance to quantify the shortage or help explain why, as manufacturers cite general categories such as manufacturing delays, third-party delays, increased demand, etc. Pfizer specifically is a major supplier of the small saline vials and has repurposed a lot of their containers for COVID vaccines, which could explain one short-term shortage, while the other is a large supplier of the small CC plungers, found a defect in the plunger itself and have had to halt all sales, which has led to an increase in demand. But others are unclear, and there's currently, unfortunately, no estimated resupply time. Not only is normal saline the most commonly used for large volumes in resuscitations, but adverse drug events can result when drugs that are typically administered as short infusions are given by IV push or replaced with other less well-known solutions that may interact differently with the medication. It would also be concerning if the need to compound drugs in a single bag resulted in dilution errors or could increase the risk of microbial contamination. Next slide, please. So in the light of this impending issue, I'd like to propose 3 short and long-term ways in which this shortage might be mitigated, particularly in the pre-hospital setting. So I'll go through each one of these 3 solutions and the evidence available for them. In case some of the slides are a little too nitty-gritty on the data, I've closed each section out with a summary slide, which you'll be able to recognize by images of the ocean, which, like was mentioned earlier, is our largest salt solution on the planet. So please be on the lookout for those slides. Next slide, please. So the first concept I'd like to introduce to this discussion is that of reducing rather than replacing. It's important to be judicial about administering fluids, as they are medications just like anything else we administer, and it can mistakenly improve vitals without necessarily improving patient outcomes. In addition, like with any intervention we do in the medical field, it's important to consider questions such as what is the patient's underlying physiology, and does giving fluids make sense with their underlying pathology? In helping address these questions, the first concept I'd like to review is the idea of permissive hypotension. Permissive hypotension is a guideline specifically for hemorrhagic or hypovolemic shock that recommends systolic blood pressure goals below physiologic normal. This means targeting systolics of 60 to 70 for penetrating trauma, 80 to 90 for blunt trauma without TBI, and 100 to 110 for blunt trauma with TBI. When considering resuscitation as being broken down into the 4 stages proposed by Vincent and DeBaker, permissive hypotension is generally only used in the initial rescue and optimization phases of recovery, which is the exact phase that EMS and pre-hospital care fall into. Next slide, please. So while hypotension seems counterintuitive in shock, it's been shown to reduce mortality by reducing the harm associated with large volume resuscitation. There are multiple ways in which this can occur. But large amounts of rapid fluid resuscitation can result in a spiral of peripheral vasodilation, which leads to further blood loss, dilutional coagulopathy, and endovascular damage through the increased hydrostatic pressure, which then further leads to disturbances in the normal coagulation cascade. So then how far out does permissive hypotension begin to cause harm? It's not a clear number in humans yet, but there have been large animal studies that have categorized prolonged hypotension as greater than 8 hours, at which lactic acidosis and organ failure associated with prolonged hypotension begin to manifest. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so what is the evidence for septic patients? The main resource utilized by providers is the Surviving Sepsis Guidelines, which have weak, as in low quality of evidence, but nevertheless recommends that the initial resuscitation from sepsis-induced hypoperfusion should receive at least 30 milliliters per kilogram of IV crystalloid fluids within the first 3 hours of resuscitation. So if you're en route to a Rule 1 or a medical facility in which that can begin within a reasonable timeline, there really isn't a strong recommendation that the fluids must be done or must begin in the pre-hospital setting. Next slide, please. Another strategy that's been increasingly utilized in emergency medicine is to assess fluid responsiveness after low boluses in patients to optimize resuscitation. What I have on the slide there is the Frank-Starling curve, and it shows that once a patient is below a certain cardiac function, they won't respond to fluids even if they're technically volume down or hypovolemic. And so this can translate into having smaller fluid bolus bags stored in EMS vehicles, or prioritizing other resuscitative measures before resuming large volume resuscitation as the patient is being reassessed. Next slide, please. Finally, there have been more studies favoring the idea of scoop and run or delayed resuscitation, which seems to be a better option when transport time to definitive care is shorter. There's a strong evidence against pre-hospital crystalloids in studies from other countries where NS and LR are widely used. I found one that was a cross-national retrospective study of multiple Asian countries where they found that trauma patients receiving pre-hospital crystalloids, even with a median transport time of 10 minutes for patients who got fluids and 11 minutes for patients who didn't get fluids, still resulted in higher in-hospital mortality and poorer functional outcomes. And this was with subgroup analysis by sex, age group, injury of mechanism, major trauma, and the incidence of hypotension on the ambulance. So there are several theories for this, including delayed transfer due to having to hang up the fluids or distractions from other life-saving interventions. And this still needs to be studied further, but it's definitely a consideration when examining the median time to transport for this county and what interventions to optimize. I was hoping to include some data from San Diego County's median transport time and amount of fluids given per transport, but I wasn't able to access the data, so would appreciate any thoughts that people might have on this during the discussion. So to summarize, part one, the principles of permissive hypotension, fluid responsiveness, and delayed resuscitation all support the idea of conservative and judicious fluid administration, which may now not only help prevent unnecessary use of IV fluids, but also improve patient outcomes. Additionally, guidelines for pre-hospital fluids could be better tailored to the specific transport times and mechanisms most commonly seen by local EMS, which could also help adjust the size of the bags or quantities of bags stored. So part two focuses on what fluids could replace NS and in what contexts. We can use this graph here to first outline where NS fits into the whole matrix of other fluids. The first big distinction is between colloids and crystalloids, with colloids including things like dextran or D5 and albumin, and then crystalloids containing things like NS, LR, and plasmolite. Colloids have solutes within them, such as dextran for D5, which doesn't cross the vascular membrane and can help draw fluid into the vasculature. Crystalloids, on the other hand, are solutions with freely permeable ions at varying concentrations, which help determine the tonicity of the vasculature. So intuitively, one would think that colloids would be more effective in expanding the intravascular volume and offering better resuscitation, but that hasn't necessarily been shown to be the case. And the consensus right now is that between the two, there's no ideal resuscitative fluid. In addition, colloids tend to be more expensive to prepare and more tedious to store. So particularly in the US, crystalloids have replaced colloids for first-line resuscitative fluid. And of those, NS is the most commonly used. So is there a scenario in which colloids can be used over NS? The surviving sepsis guidelines say with weak strength that probably not in the case of septic shock. They only recommend switching to albumin if crystalloids are insufficient, and there aren't enough efficacy or safety studies to say the same about other synthetic colloids like dextrose or gelatin. On the other hand, D5 might have better efficacy due to its dextrose content for resuscitating patients in whom you're worried about ketosis or are already in a glucose starvation state. This can include pregnant people with prolonged nausea and vomiting or severe alcohol intoxication patients. That being said, I didn't come across strong enough evidence to say that D5 could replace other crystalloids like NS or LR in the pre-hospital setting. And in addition, I also found a study that was pretty alarming from a Japanese medical center's ICU, which was trying to switch out drug diluents from NS to D5. They noted that midway through the study, they had to change out their entire protocol from automatically selecting for D5 in cases that doctors didn't specify the diluent to NS, to replacing NS as the standard because they saw unstable blood glucose levels in ICU patients who were getting intermittent D5 infusions. Obviously, this is in very sick patients and in the ICU setting. But upon my research, there just wasn't enough data to guide recommendations on replacing NS with D5 that could be non-inferiorly diluted or used to dilute medications. And in most cases, recommendations is to switch from NS to another crystalloid. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so then taking a closer look at other crystalloids, there have been studies focused on testing different concentrations of saline solutions and determining therapeutic efficacy with solutions that may require less volume and so is therefore more transportable and can be used in smaller volumes. For example, a study comparing 3% and 23.4% hypertonic saline in the initial resuscitation of TBI patients found no difference in hospital mortality and actually more reliable goal sodium levels reached within the first 24 hours for the 23.4% hypertonic saline group. There are separate guidelines that would need to be established for infusion rates at different different saline concentrations. But if this can be replicated in RCT trials, it could suggest that much lower saline volumes are needed to achieve the same resuscitation. And then the main focus within crystalloids that I wanted to make is for LR, which is kind of the moon to NS's sun for common IV resuscitation crystalloids. In its composition, it's less acidic than NS and has more physiologic ions, including potassium, calcium, and lactate. And it's quickly rising as one of the first line agents in crystalloid fluids. Next slide, please. So when comparing the two, NS is the most acidic and most hypertonic of the crystalloids. So it's been linked to concerns of AKI, hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis, and has also been shown to induce a cascade of inflammatory markers in large animal models, which may further contribute to its deleterious effects. On the other hand, LR is associated with more cross-reactivity with pharmacologic agents, mostly due to its calcium content, which can interfere with blood transfusions. So it's currently not recommended to administer through the same line as blood, and can interact with drugs by binding them and depositing them in lung and renal tissue. Some of these are listed below and are commonly utilized drugs. Ketamine is on that list as well. In terms of the other electrolytes in LR, there was concern early on about the potassium content in LR worsening hyperkalemia in patients, but there have been several studies to debunk this, and currently hyperkalemia is not a contraindication in giving LR. And the last thing I wanted to debunk about LR is the cost. So at least in our ED and per the wholesalers database for our emergency department, LR and NS are the same price per liter, which even our ED pharmacist was surprised to find. Next slide, please. So more studies are being released to bring LR to the forefront of fluid resuscitation, and this is just a list of the relevant studies for those interested in further reading. And while none of them are conclusive on its own, I think overall their effect has been in highlighting that LR is a non-inferior solution to NS for patients requiring fluids. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so to summarize part two, don't sleep on LR. It's the rapidly emerging first-line crystalloid for IV fluids, with more studies coming out to show its efficacy in larger volume resuscitation. Plus, it's the same cost, although it doesn't mean that whatever causes are driving the NS shortage won't complicate the LR supply further down the line. And it doesn't mean that you don't need to consider the separate safety profiles and drug interactions, as the fluids are medications, just like any other drug you would administer. On the other hand, colloids like D5 continue to be second line, especially in the United States, but there may be kind of possibilities to fit them into certain lines of medication diluents or for certain patients. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so part three focuses more on blood transfusions and the idea of replacing blood with blood in hemorrhagic trauma patients. So to finish up the rest of the history of blood transfusions, the concept of the walking blood banks reemerged on the battlefield during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the idea of the golden hour for hemorrhage control and the administration of blood products was popularized during this time. Studies now show that this window is actually much shorter and within the first 20 to 30 minutes. And at least in our Valkyrie training, we've been taught that the 36 minutes to blood back is kind of the rule. In 2004, the 31st Combat Support Hospital in Baghdad began using ABO type specific whole blood as a salvage therapy and found that whole blood was more effective in reversing shock and coagulopathy than with stored RBC or blood products. The Rangers began developing the Ranger O low titer or ROLO program in 2014. And in current TCCC guidelines, blood products are touted over colloid or crystalloid solutions for massive hemorrhage. Alrighty, next slide, please. So what is the data to support pre-hospital blood products? It really comes from pre-hospital combat data, which demonstrated that of all the potentially survivable combat deaths that occurred before the patient reached a Role 2 facility, 90% of these patients died from hemorrhage. In addition, we've had studies like the one published in JAMA, which show that early blood transfusion within the first 15 minutes of injury are associated with markedly reduced both 24-hour mortality and 30-day survival. Next slide, please. So this is where the U.S. Marine Corps Valkyrie program comes in. The program is located right here in Southern California at Camp Pendleton and began in response to a blood transfusion initiative undertaken at the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division under Lieutenant Colonel J. Lapp in November of 2017. The pioneers from this course recognized the need to train battalion general duty corpsmen to fill the capability. And I had a video to show you, but I won't be able to play it today. So next slide, please. I can detail a little bit more about the training process. So the Valkyrie training is comprised of 1 instructional day, followed by 3 application days. And the bulk of the training involves practical application with the use of live blood. In this case, the donor is the patient and the donor in the scenario. So it's a self-transfusion for these practical application courses. And each scenario is performed timed from the point of injury to the time that blood is given, and then additionally fast forwarded through several hours into the scenario to allow a comprehensive review of ATLS and TCCC. Applicants are also trained on how to select the ideal donor from a selection of mock donor cards, which helps simulate activating the walking blood bank and finding the ideal donor. And they use real field kits with strategies to maximize sterility as they set up their equipment in a variety of locations. Next slide, please. So the data on the safety and efficacy of whole blood transfusions have been increasingly translated into the civilian setting, as well as with the development of more robust military training and utilization programs. This is the first analysis of large volume whole blood transfusions in civilian traumas that I could find, and at least within the 42 patients that they studied, there were 0 transfusion reactions compared to component blood. Next slide, please. So how does this look in the civilian sector? So for civilian EMS providers, the cold stored whole blood from donation centers to the field is the most feasible method of obtaining low titer O whole blood. And this has been successfully achieved and implemented at the Southwest Texas Regional Advisory Council, or STRAC, which is currently the largest network for low titer O whole blood in the US. It's a collaborated system between South Texas Blood Bank and Tissue Center and the SS Army Research Center to develop stored whole blood and transfusion in the pre-hospital setting for helicopter EMS. Their scope covers 70 EMS agencies, 2 level 1 trauma centers, and then 28 level 3 and 4 trauma centers. And kind of the beauty of having this large network is that after 14 days of cold whole blood storage on an EMS vehicle, which is kind of a less ideal setting for storage, they can move the blood into more readily available supplies at trauma centers, thereby reducing waste. Their scope also allows for rural services to reliably have whole blood in stock, and in case of a mass casualty incident, activate a far more readily available blood bank for which to supply their inventory. They have a wealth of research through their caseloads that can be accessed on their website. Also in Texas is the first total ground EMS to have whole blood stocked in their vehicles. And their system also works because they partner with the Gulf Coast Regional Blood Center to rotate inventory from their EMS vehicles to community medical center settings to reduce waste. The method of testing and inclusion protocols for low titer blood is credited to the Army Blood Program. Next slide, please. So in summary, the U.S. military has been developing whole blood transfusions and training for whole blood transfusions for several years, with one major training and research site located in Camp Pendleton, California. These methods are now being translated successfully into large-scale whole blood distribution and utilization systems, such as STRAC's Regional Whole Blood Program, and both provide models for safe and effective testing, transport, and administration in the pre-hospital setting. While still a work in progress, whole blood may provide a long-term solution for resuscitation in patients with massive hemorrhage. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so I'd like to open up the remainder of the time to our open forum discussion, and thank you again for everybody at Naval Medical Center San Diego who helped create this presentation.